The sun was still low in the sky when the general reached the small regional airport. He liked arriving early, not because he feared missing flights, but because he enjoyed watching people. After years of service, people watching had become his quiet habit. It helped him understand the world he had once protected. He moved slowly but confidently, carrying a single, old military-style bag that had been with him for decades. The bag looked worn, but he cared for it the way someone cared for an old friend. The airport was not crowded that morning. A few families stood near the check-in counters. Some business travelers scrolled on their phones, and a couple of college students whispered excitedly about their trip. Everything seemed calm, but something about the air felt slightly tense. The general noticed it, the way trained eyes noticed small shifts. Still, he didn't assume anything. He just kept walking toward the security line as he approached. The officers at the front were checking passengers one by one. Most officers looked relaxed, doing their work without rush. But one officer at the far end looked different. He stood too stiffly, scanned everyone too quickly, and seemed eager to find something wrong. His uniform was new, his badge polished, and his expression carried the seriousness of someone wanted to prove he could handle big responsibilities. When the general stepped forward and placed his bag on the belt, the young officer's eyes narrowed. He glanced at the bag, then at the general, then back at the bag again. Something in the officer's face shifted, as if he had been waiting for something unusual to appear, and now he believed he had found it. "Sir, I need you to step aside for an additional check," the officer said. His voice was firm, maybe a little too firm. The general nodded politely. Of course. He had nothing to hide. He had traveled with the same bag for years, and no one had ever questioned it. But he understood that officers had jobs to do. Sometimes extra checks happened. Most of the time, they were done with respect and finished quickly. But this time was different. The officer picked up the bag with both hands, turning it around as if it were something dangerous. His fingers pressed against the old patches sewn onto the cloth. One patch had the general's former unit symbol. Another had the faded outline of a mission logo, barely visible anymore. The officer stared at them as though they were coded messages. "What's in this bag?" the officer asked sharply. "Just personal belongings," the general replied. "I'll decide that." The officer muttered under his breath. The general heard it, but he didn't react. He had dealt with far worse attitudes in his life. A single comment from a young officer was nothing compared to the pressure of real missions. Still, he began to sense the situation drifting in an uncomfortable direction. The officer unzipped the bag and pulled things out one by one. A folded jacket, a notebook, a pair of old gloves, a metal canteen. Everything was simple, ordinary, harmless, but the officer's expression tightened even more. "What is this?" he demanded, holding up the canteen. "A canteen," the general answered calmly. "It looks old. It is old. Where did you get it?" The question felt unnecessary, but the general stayed patient. "From my time in service," the officer paused, then said, "Service." "What service?" The general reached into his pocket and pulled out his identification. "I served in the military." The officer glanced at the ID but barely read it. He didn't even check the name properly. He only flicked his eyes over the card, then put it aside dismissively. "Anyone can make something like this," the officer said. The general looked at him silently. It wasn't anger in his eyes. It was disappointment, the kind that came from seeing someone misuse authority. Without fully understanding it, there is nothing wrong with my ID, the general said. Softly. "We'll see about that," the officer replied. A few passengers looked over. Some whispered to each other. Most didn't understand what was happening, but they could sense the tension. One older woman frowned in confusion, as if wondering why someone who looked calm and respectful was being treated so harshly. The officer signaled to another staff member. "I'm taking him to the holding room for questioning." The staff member hesitated. "Are you sure?" "Yes," the officer snapped. The general didn't argue. He had learned long ago that raising his voice rarely solved problems. Instead, he picked up the items the officer hadn't already taken and followed him quietly. His steps were slow, steady, never aggressive or defensive. He walked with the dignity that came from a lifetime of leadership. They reached a small room with plain walls and a simple table. The officer closed the door behind them. "Sit," the officer ordered. The general sat. The officer placed the bag on the table as though it contained something suspicious. He turned it over, shook it, and checked every pocket. The general watched silently. He didn't want to embarrass the officer. But he also didn't understand why the man was acting this way. "You said you were in the military," the officer said again. "Yes." "Why are you carrying old gear?" "Because it belongs to me. And these patches, they're part of my history." The officer tapped the table with his fingers. "Something doesn't add up." The general took a quiet breath. "Son, I understand you have a job to do. But I've already shown you my ID. If you check it properly," "I said I'll decide what's proper," the officer interrupted. The general's eyes lowered for a moment, not in fear, but in reflection. He had trained many young soldiers in the past. Some were humble and eager to learn. Others were too proud at first, believing authority came from the badge, not from character. He recognized that same energy in this officer. Minutes passed. The general remained seated, his hands calm on the table. The officer paced back and forth, occasionally checking the bag again, as though expecting something to magically appear. "Why are you traveling today?" the officer suddenly asked. "To visit family. You have proof of that?" "I don't need proof to visit family." The officer's frustration grew. The more calm the general stayed, the more the officer seemed to feel his control slipping. He pressed his lips together and tried to look stern. This could take a while. The officer finally said. The general nodded. "I understand." The truth was, the general knew this situation should never have started. He had never caused trouble in public, never broken rules, never disrespected authority. Yet here he was, treated like a suspect without reason. Outside the room, the airport activity continued. People checked in, security lines moved, announcements echoed through the speakers. But the delay caused by the officer's fixation quietly started affecting the flow. A few airport staff whispered about a passenger being held for an unusual check. A senior supervisor glanced toward the holding area, wondering why no updates had been made. Inside the room, the officer was still trying to justify the detention in his mind. He wanted to prove he had sharp instincts. He wanted recognition. He wanted to show he was someone important. But he didn't understand that true authority didn't come from suspicion. It came from fairness. The general sat in the quiet room, thinking about how strange life could be. After years of facing real threats, real pressure, real danger, he now found himself in a small airport room because of a misunderstanding, created by a single officer's attitude. He looked around the plain walls and the flickering fluorescent light above. There was no anger inside him, just patience and a sense of clarity. He could have pushed back, argued, demanded to see someone higher in command. But he didn't. He believed in letting situations unfold before stepping in. Yet even with all his patience, he understood something important. This officer wasn't going to let him go anytime soon, and that meant one thing: sooner or later. He would need to make a call, but for now he remained silent, waiting. Giving the young officer every chance to correct the mistake on his own, the room stayed quiet, the tension lingering in the air. As the general sat there, calm, respectful, but knowing deep inside that this moment was only the beginning of a much bigger lesson. The officer was about to learn. The young officer returned to the room after several minutes, holding a clipboard as if it gave him more authority than he already believed he had. The general stayed seated, hands relaxed on the table, eyes calm. He had been in tougher rooms than this rooms, where decisions were a matter of life and death. This one was just painted in plain white, with a buzzing light overhead and faint sounds from the airport drifting in through the SES door. The officer closed the door sharply, as if he wanted the sound to send a message. "We're going to continue this questioning," he said, without sitting down. The general simply nodded. The officer paced back and forth again, tapping the clipboard with his fingers. It was a nervous habit more than a confident one. Every few steps, he would stop and stare at the general, as though trying to see something hidden. You know, the officer began. Most passengers don't carry old military equipment when they travel, especially things like that canteen. It's too old to be normal. The general looked at the table where the officer had placed the items earlier. It's old because I've had it for a long time, he said in a gentle tone. That's not an explanation, the officer replied. Quickly, it's the truth. The general said. The officer let out a frustrated breath. Look, I don't know who you think you are, but you need to understand something. I have a duty to keep this airport safe, and if something seems suspicious, I have to act. That's my job. The general nodded again. Every job has responsibility. The officer didn't seem to appreciate the calm response. He squinted at the general as if expecting him to break under pressure, but the general had endured far more than this. His silence wasn't resistance. It was discipline. Another few seconds passed. Then the officer leaned forward. Tell me exactly what you did in the military. I served my country, the general answered. That's not enough. What did you do? What was your role? What unit? The general remained calm. You did not properly read my identification. All of that information is there. I said, I'll decide what's valid, the officer snapped. The general's eyes softened. Not out of pity, but out of understanding. He had trained people like this, young, eager, determined to appear strong, but confused about what real strength looked like. He wondered how many people this officer had questioned this way. How many had been intimidated simply because they didn't know how to respond. Why don't you verify my ID properly? The general suggested gently. I don't need to, the officer said immediately. For a moment the room felt even smaller. The officer wasn't just unsure, he was stubborn. He wanted to be right more than he wanted to be fair. And the general could see that clearly now. Outside the door, footsteps passed. A faint announcement echoed from the terminal speakers about a delayed boarding. The general wondered if it was his flight. Time was moving, but the officer seemed stuck in his own mission. The officer finally sat down across from him, leaning forward as if this were some kind of interrogation. Let's start again, he said. Why are you traveling today? To visit family, the general repeated. Where do they live? The general gave the name of a city. Why are you going now? The general looked down at his hands, then back at the officer. Because it has been some time since I last saw them. That's vague, the officer muttered. The general offered a thin smile. Sometimes life is vague. The officer didn't appreciate that answer either. He sat back, folding his arms tightly. I think you're hiding something. What do you believe I'm hiding? The general asked softly. I don't know, the officer said. But something doesn't fit. The general could have responded in many ways. He could have defended himself, raised his voice, or questioned the officer's training. But none of that would help. Instead, he waited. Sometimes silence reveals more than words. The officer stood up again and started, rummaging through the bag for the third time. He checked every pocket, even the ones he had already emptied. He held up the old gloves and squinted at them as if they held answers. These gloves, he said. Where did you get them? They were given to me during my service. The officer turned them over. They're too old to be useful. They're meaningful, the general replied. That doesn't matter. It matters to me. The officer tossed the gloves onto the table. And this notebook? A simple notebook, the general said. Some memories written inside. Can I read it? The general finally shook his head. No. The officer's eyebrows rose. Why not? If you have nothing to hide because they are my personal memories, the general said, his voice still soft but firm. They are not a threat. The officer pressed his lips together again. He didn't like boundaries. Not when he wanted control. He placed the notebook down and exhaled sharply, pacing again. The general watched him. He wasn't judging. He was observing. The officer was too determined, too tense. The job had gotten inside his head, and now everything looked like a risk. Time passed. The general didn't know how long he had been inside the room, but it felt long enough that the officer should have realized the mistake. Yet the officer seemed more convinced than ever. Finally, the officer stopped pacing and turned to him. "This will take longer than expected," he said. "I understand," the general replied. The officer looked surprised. Maybe he expected anger or impatience, but the general's calmness made him more uneasy. "You're awfully calm for someone being detained," the officer said. "Calmness is part of who I am," the general responded. "That's suspicious." The general almost smiled, not out of humor, but disbelief. "Being calm is suspicious? When someone has something to hide, they act calm to cover it," the officer said. As if quoting something he had learned from a training video, the general took a long breath. Not out of frustration, but as a way to steady the moment. "Or sometimes people are calm because they trust the truth," he said. The officer didn't respond. He just turned away. Outside, footsteps approached and paused near the door. The officer didn't notice, but the general did. He heard whispers of other staff discussing the delay and wondering what was happening. One voice sounded unsure. Another sounded annoyed. The general was patient. But he also knew something important. This couldn't go on forever. The officer turned back to him again. "I'm giving you one more chance." "Chance for what?" the general asked. "To tell me the real reason you're traveling. I already told you the truth." The officer stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I don't believe you," that the general said softly, "is the problem." The officer's jaw tightened. "Are you trying to challenge me?" "No," the general said. "I'm trying to help you see reason." The officer took a breath and pointed at the door. "I'll be right back." "Do not move." The general nodded. When the officer left the room, the general finally let a few seconds of quiet wash over him. He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of the situation. Not anger, not fear, just a tired acceptance. Life had a funny way of testing patience in unexpected places. He opened his eyes slowly and looked at the table. His belongings sat there, treated like evidence when all they held were memories. The old jacket had patches worn from sun and time. The gloves had stains from moments he didn't talk about. The canteen had scratches from long walks through difficult terrain. Everything meant something. Everything had history. But to the officer, they were just excuses for suspicion. The general leaned back in the chair. His posture remained straight, almost dignified. Even in a plain room with no windows, he carried himself like someone who understood discipline better than anyone else in the building. Minutes passed before the officer returned. His steps were quick, louder this time. He pushed the door open and entered with even more confidence, as if he had convinced himself that he was right. "We're not done," the officer said. "We have more questions." The general nodded. "Then ask." The officer sat down again. "Are you traveling alone?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because I choose to." "That sounds like you're hiding who you're meeting." The general shook his head slowly. "I'm not meeting anyone." The officer leaned back, crossing his arms. "You're not making this easy. I'm telling you the truth," the general replied. Silence filled the room again. Finally, the general looked at the officer with steady eyes and said something he hadn't said until now. "Young man, have you verified my ID with your system?" "I don't need to run everything through the system," the officer said quickly. "That is not proper procedure," the general said gently. The officer stiffened. "Don't tell me how to do my job." "Not," the general said. "But your job requires accuracy." The officer opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, there was a knock on the door. A soft, uncertain knock. Another staff member peeked inside. "The supervisor wants an update," he said. The officer frowned. "Tell them I'm handling it." The staff member hesitated, then nodded and left. The door closed again. The general looked at the officer. Realizing this was about more than suspicion, it was about pride. Pride that was turning into a mistake. He knew what would have to happen next. He wouldn't push it yet. But he understood something clearly now. A moment was coming when he would have to step in, and when he did, the officer's attitude would change very quickly. But for now, he waited calm, patient, knowing the truth always came to light in the end. The room felt even smaller now. as if the walls had quietly moved in while the officer kept insisting on questions that led nowhere. The general sat with the same calm posture he had held from the start, but his patience had grown heavier. Not thinner, just heavier. Like a weight he was carrying without complaint. The officer returned to the table again, dropping the clipboard with a louder sound than needed. "We're not finished," he said, trying to sound as firm as possible. The general didn't respond with irritation. He simply folded his hands together and gave a small nod. "Go ahead." The officer drew in a breath and leaned forward. "You're acting too calm. That tells me you're hiding something." Gosh. The general almost smiled at the logic. "Or it means I've learned to stay steady in difficult situations." "That's what people say when they're trying to avoid the truth," the officer said. The general looked at him with steady eyes. "No, it's what people say when they've lived long enough to know fear doesn't solve anything." For a moment, the officer's confidence shook, but he quickly straightened up again, refusing to let the general's calmness affect him. He walked to the door and opened it slightly, glancing outside. The hallway was busy with staff moving around, talking quietly, checking screens. Someone from another department tried to approach him, but the officer lifted a hand as if to shut them out. He closed the door again and turned back to the general. "You're not going anywhere until I understand your story." "My story is very simple," the general said gently. "You just haven't listened to it yet." The officer stiffened at that. He didn't like being told he was missing something. A long moment passed before the officer finally sat again. "Let's go through your things one more time," he said. He reached for the canteen, holding it up like it was a clue and a mystery. "This why would you carry something so old?" "It's been with me through hard days," the general said. "That's sentimental," the officer muttered. "Is that a crime?" the general asked softly. The officer ignored the question. He picked up the gloves, then the old jacket, then the notebook again. He shook his head each time, as if the items themselves were refusing to give him answers. "They don't make sense. They make sense to me." "They make sense to me," the general responded. "That's enough." The officer slammed the notebook down harder than needed. It wasn't anger at the general. It was frustration at himself. He couldn't understand why he couldn't crack the man in front of him. "You're not helping this process," he said. "I'm answering every question you ask," the general replied. "But not in the way I need," the officer said. The general tilted his head slightly. "And how do you need me to answer?" The officer had no reply. He stood up abruptly and paced in circles again. Minutes passed in silence, except for the officer's footsteps and the faint hum of airport activity beyond the door. Outside, the shift in atmosphere was growing. Staff members were starting to question the delay. A supervisor had checked the security logs twice. A few passengers waiting for boarding had noticed security personnel moving more quickly than usual. Inside the room, the general kept watching the officer with patient eyes. Finally, the officer stopped pacing and pointed at him. "Why don't you just admit something?" "Admit what?" The general asked. "That you're not who you say you are." The general took a slow breath. "I never lied to you." "Oh." The officer shook his head, unwilling to accept that. "Everyone lies when they want to avoid trouble." "Not everyone," the general said. The officer rubbed his temples. His frustration looked like it was turning into doubt, but he didn't want to show it. The general watched him for a moment, then finally asked, "May I ask you something?" The officer hesitated. "What?" "How long have you been working here?" "Long enough," the officer said. The general's voice stayed soft. "Long enough to know procedures?" The officer's jaw tightened. "Of course. Then why haven't you verified my identification?" the general asked. The officer didn't answer. "It's a simple step," the general continued. "One scan would tell you everything." "System," the officer snapped. "That's not what your training taught." "You," the general said gently. The officer's eyes flashed with irritation. "Don't act like you know my job." "I don't claim to," the general replied. "I only understand responsibility." The words landed heavier than either of them expected. Responsibility. The officer looked away for a moment, as if the word itself reminded him of something he didn't want to face. A knock interrupted the silence. Not a soft one this time. A firmer one. The door opened just a little, enough for another staff member to speak. "We need to start boarding soon," the staff member said. "The delay is causing issues." The officer waved his hand dismissively. "I said I'm handling it." The staff member hesitated. "The supervisor is asking for an update again." "I said I'm handling it," the officer repeated. Louder, the staff member backed away and closed the door. The general watched quietly. He had been in positions where people avoided responsibility. He had also been in positions where people held too tightly to it. The officer was in the second category, trying to prove something at the cost of clarity. The officer paced again, breathing deeply. "You're making everything difficult," he said. "I'm cooperating fully," the general said. "Not enough." The general remained silent. The officer suddenly stopped and turned toward him. "Do you have someone who can confirm your identity?" The general studied him for a moment. "Yes," the officer blinked, surprised. "You do?" "Yes," the general said. "Someone who knows exactly who I am." "And you didn't tell me before?" the officer demanded. "You never asked," the general said gently. The officer crossed his arms. "Fine. Who is it?" The general leaned back slightly. "A former colleague." "Former colleague," the officer repeated skeptically. "From the military?" "Yes." "And what? They're supposed to just pick up the phone and help you." "Yes," the general said again. The officer laughed once, not out of humor, but disbelief. "You expect me to believe someone important will just answer your call?" The general didn't answer. He simply looked at the officer with a steady gaze. The officer frowned, then waved his hand. "Even if I let you make a call, it wouldn't change anything. Protocol doesn't work like that." The general spoke softly. "You've ignored protocol since the moment you stopped me." The officer froze. The general continued, still gentle, still calm. "If you want the truth, you need to follow the rules of your own job, not bend them." The officer inhaled sharply. For the first time since the morning began, he didn't seem fully in control. Doubt slipped into his expression, even though he tried to hide it behind firmness. The general watched him with patience. But inside, he knew this moment mattered. He knew the officer was standing at a crossroads. Either continue down the path of stubborn pride or take the step needed to see the truth. The officer pulled out a small pad of paper from his pocket and tossed it onto the table. "Fine," he said. "Write the number." The general nodded once. Slowly, he took the pad and pen. He wrote the number in a steady hand. The officer looked at the number, then shook his head. "This can't be real." "It's real," the general said. The officer didn't believe him. But he dialed the number anyway, using the room's landline. As it rang, he rolled his eyes, expecting no one important to answer, but someone did. The officer's posture changed instantly. His back straightened, and his expression froze. He didn't expect the voice on the other end. Authoritative and unmistakably high, ranking. Suddenly, the officer looked smaller, more uncertain. He swallowed hard and held the phone. Out to the general took it gently. The officer watched as the general spoke in a calm, respectful tone. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't complain. He simply explained the situation with clarity, as if he were reporting a routine matter. When he ended the call, the general placed the phone down quietly. He didn't need to say anything. The officer already looked shaken. The general leaned back and waited. He wasn't smug. He wasn't proud. He was just patient because he knew something the officer didn't. That phone call had already changed. Everything. It was still early in the morning when he woke up, but something inside him felt different. The strange tension from the previous day still lingered in his chest, yet there was also a quiet strength growing in him. As he sat at the edge of the bed, he took a slow breath and tried to understand what was happening inside his mind. The day ahead was supposed to be simple, but nothing felt simple anymore. Everything around him was shifting, and he could feel that he was slowly changing with it. He opened the window and let the cool morning breeze touch his face. For a moment, he closed his eyes and allowed the air to steady his thoughts. He wondered how one unexpected incident could shake a person so deeply. Even though no one intended harm, the small misunderstandings, the small mistakes, and the unwanted pressure from strangers had added weight to his heart. He felt like he had been carrying something heavy without realizing it. But today, he wanted to understand it. Today, he wanted to face it instead of avoiding it. He moved around his small room with slow steps, noticing details he usually ignored. The cup on the table, the jacket on the chair, the bag on the floor, ordinary things, yet for some reason, they looked different to him. Like they were part of a story he could now see more clearly. He realized he had been living in a rush, often unable to slow down long enough to appreciate anything. Maybe that was why he felt overwhelmed yesterday. Maybe the world felt heavier because he never gave himself time to breathe. After getting ready, he walked out of the house. The streets were still quiet. A few people were opening their shops, sweeping the front floors, preparing for a new day. He nodded at a man who always sat near the corner shop, sipping his morning tea. The man lifted his cup with a small smile. Such a simple gesture, yet it made him feel grounded. Maybe this was how people kept going, tiny moments of connection. Tiny reminders that they were not alone. He kept walking until he reached a small cafe he often passed but rarely entered. Today, he stepped inside. The warm smell of fresh coffee filled the air, mixing with the gentle sound of clinking cups. He chose a seat near the window, letting the morning light fall on the table. When the server approached, he ordered something simple. He didn't even think much about it. He just wanted a quiet moment to sit with his thoughts. While waiting, he watched people outside. A mother holding her child's hand. A man unlocking his motorcycle. A young couple laughing softly. Life outside looked ordinary, yet every person carried their own hidden stories. He wondered how many of them were dealing with their own struggles, their own moments of confusion or doubt, the same way he was. The server brought his drink with a gentle smile. He thanked her, and for the first time in a long while, he felt genuinely grateful for such a small kindness. As he took his first sip, he felt the warmth travel through him. He let it calm him down, slow him down, make him feel present in the moment. He took out a small notebook he rarely used. The first page was blank. He stared at it for a few seconds before writing a single line. I need to understand myself better. It wasn't a dramatic sentence. It wasn't meant to impress anyone. It was just the truth he had finally accepted. He kept writing slowly, patiently. Not everything made sense. Some sentences were messy. Some words did not feel perfect, but he didn't stop. He let his thoughts spill onto the page without judgment. The weight he had been carrying began to loosen. He didn't realize how much he needed this quiet space until now. After some time, he closed the notebook and leaned back. He felt a little lighter, though he wasn't sure why. Maybe because he finally allowed himself to pause. Maybe because he started listening to his own voice instead of everyone else's. Or maybe because he was finally honest with himself. He spent the next hour simply observing the world and letting himself feel whatever came naturally. He didn't rush. He didn't force anything. He just existed, and for the first time in a while, it felt enough. Eventually he stood up, thanked the server again, and stepped outside. The sun had risen higher, and the streets were livelier now. He walked slowly, taking in the sounds, the colors, the movements, the simple beauty he had ignored for so long. As he reached the end of the street, his phone buzzed. It was a message from someone he had been avoiding since yesterday. Instead of the tightness he expected, he felt calm. He opened the message. The words were simple, apologetic, and honest. He read them twice, then took a deep breath. He replied with understanding instead of frustration. He didn't overthink it. He didn't let yesterday's heaviness guide him. He simply responded with clarity and kindness, because that was who he wanted to be now. As he continued walking, he realized something important. Growth didn't always come from big moments. Sometimes it emerged from the quiet spaces between them, the moments when a person chose patience over anger, reflection over reaction, honesty over avoidance. He wasn't sure what the rest of the day would bring. He wasn't sure how things would unfold with the people involved in his story. but he didn't need to know everything right now. He was learning to take life one breath at a time, one choice at a time. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to walk it with a steady heart. He turned the corner, stepped onto a wider street, and continued moving forward, not rushing, not hiding, not escaping, just moving gently and confidently toward whatever waited for him next. And without realizing it, this small shift within him would soon shape everything that happened afterward, setting the stage for a moment he never expected, a moment that would test his calmness and reveal how much he had truly changed. The morning felt calmer than any day before, yet there was a quiet tension beneath the surface, like the stillness that comes before a storm. He woke up early again, but this time he didn't feel lost or confused. Instead, he felt aware of his thoughts, aware of the weight of the past days, and aware of the decisions he needed to make. There was something different about the air. It wasn't heavy or sharp. It simply carried the feeling that something important would happen soon. He sat on the side of the bed for a long moment, letting his mind settle. The sunlight coming through the window felt warm on his face, and for the first time in what felt like a long while, he let himself enjoy that simple warmth. It reminded him that life could still feel gentle even after long moments of pressure or confusion. A soft vibration from his phone broke the silence. He picked it up and saw a message from someone he had not heard from in a while. Not the officer, not the people involved in the misunderstanding. This was someone who had simply stepped back because of the chaos happening around him. The message was simple, just a small check-in, but it made his chest warm. It reminded him that not everyone around him carried conflict. Some people simply cared. He replied with a few honest words, and for a moment he felt lighter. He stretched, stood up, and allowed himself a slow start. No rushing. No overthinking. No trying to predict how things would go. Just being present. After getting ready, he stepped outside. The air was fresh and cool, carrying the smell of early morning. The streets were just beginning to fill with movement. People walking to work, opening shops, or waiting for buses. He felt a quiet connection to them, even though none of them knew him or what had happened. Maybe everyone was fighting their own smaller or bigger battles. He made his way toward the small cafe he visited the previous day. Something about that place felt safe, almost grounding. When he entered, the familiar smell of warm drinks wrapped around him again. The server recognized him and gave a small nod. He felt a surprising sense of comfort seeing that simple gesture. He sat in the same spot near the window. As he waited for his drink, he took out the notebook he had used the day before. The page he had written on looked simple but meaningful. He read his words again. I need to understand myself better. It didn't sound like a dramatic revelation, yet it carried a truth he had ignored for a long time. He turned to a new page and wrote, Today, I want to face things with patience. In the past, he might have reacted quickly, might have carried the stress from one moment into another. But now he wanted to respond, not react. Before he could write more, his phone rang. The name on the screen made him sit up straight. It was someone connected to the incident. Someone who normally wouldn't call him unless it was important. He answered, keeping his voice calm. The person on the other end spoke politely, almost carefully, explaining that a follow-up conversation was needed. Not about trouble, not about blame, just clarity, proper clarity. The kind that had been missing for days. He agreed. When he hung up, he didn't feel anger or anxiety. He felt ready. Ready to walk into that conversation with a quieter heart and a clearer mind. He took a few minutes to finish his drink before standing up. As he left the cafe, he nodded to the server again. She returned the gesture with the same friendly warmth she had shown before. The walk toward the office where the meeting was arranged felt strangely peaceful. The city noise surrounded him, yet he wasn't overwhelmed by it. His steps were steady, and his thoughts didn't chase themselves the way they used to. He felt more in control than he had felt in a long time. When he entered the building, he was greeted politely. People seemed more aware now, more respectful, more careful with their words and tone. Maybe word had spread about the misunderstanding. Maybe people had realized that rushing to judgment did more harm than good. He was led into a room where two individuals were already waiting. Their posture looked tense, but their expressions were calm and apologetic. They stood up as he entered. "Thank you for coming," one of them said in a steady voice. He nodded simply and took a seat. The conversation began gently. There was no blaming, no defensive tone. They explained how certain signals had been misunderstood, how assumptions had turned into unnecessary tension, and how things had escalated far more than they should have. He listened quietly without interrupting, letting them speak everything they needed to say. When they finally finished, he took a slow breath before responding. He didn't raise his voice or show frustration. Instead, he spoke clearly, explaining how the chain of events made him feel, how simple communication could have prevented everything, and how he hoped no one else would go through something similar. The room felt still when he finished. His words weren't dramatic, but they carried weight because they were honest. The two people across from him nodded with understanding. One of them leaned forward slightly. "We appreciate your patience," they said, "and we truly regret what you experienced. We want to make sure this doesn't happen again." Hearing that eased something deep inside him. He wasn't looking for blame or punishment. He just wanted fairness, clarity, and respect. And now he felt like he finally had them. The meeting ended on a calm note. They shook hands politely before he left. As he walked out of the building, he felt lighter than he had in days. The misunderstanding wasn't a pleasant experience, but it had forced him to pause, reflect, and understand himself in a way he had been avoiding for a long time. On his way back, the sun felt warmer, the air felt easier to breathe, and the world felt a little more open. He decided to walk instead of taking any transport. He wanted to appreciate the feeling of moving forward, literally and emotionally, as he walked past a small park. He sat on a bench for a moment, watching people move around, children running, elders sitting quietly, workers passing by. He realized life never truly stopped. Even when someone felt stuck inside their own head, the world kept moving, gently inviting them to move with it. He closed his eyes and took a long, deep breath. The weeks of tension slowly faded into the background. He wasn't the same person who walked into that situation. He was calmer now, more patient, more understanding of himself. He wasn't sure what the future would bring, but he knew one thing clearly. He could handle it with a steadier heart. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone. He didn't need to rush or react or worry about every little detail. He only needed to stay true to himself. After a few minutes, he stood up again and continued his walk, feeling grounded, peaceful, and ready for whatever came next. His story didn't end with a dramatic twist or a loud moment. It ended with calm, control, and a gentle reminder that sometimes the most powerful strength is simply choosing patience and clarity over chaos. And as he walked home beneath the warm afternoon sun, he carried that strength with him quietly, confidently and fully aware of how far he had come.